This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard. It is study tape lecture number 2 and was originally given to students of the St. Hill Special Briefing course on 9 July 1964. The title of this lecture is Studying Data Assimilation. It is 72 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Arrow Productions.
How are you today?
Fine.
What's the date? 9 July. 9 July AD 14. All right. Now, what are you weakest in? Auditing. Yeah. Frankly, I haven't anything to talk to you about because you're all doing so well. But in trying to assimilate a piece of information, these are the points to watch, and these are the points that trip you. Nomenclature. Nomenclature. What does a word mean? And that's what trips you, basically, because then you cannot read a sentence with that word in it and know what the sentence says. So nomenclature is a major stumbling block in any study. And part of nomenclature is the recognition of what the definition is. It's one thing just to have the definition. It's another thing to have an idea of what the definition means. Now, you're in a never-never land that has never been explored. There is no language to adequately represent any parts of the mind. If you used any terminology that is used by the psychiatrist, you don't know what you're getting into. You frankly have no clue what you're getting into. Because he's way out, man. And when he uses a word to describe something, there may be innuendos in relationship to that word that would, if we then used it, would impart a totally incorrect zone or area and would make somebody think he knew what you were talking about when he hadn't a clue what you were talking about. So you've crossed up your terminology with some other field that meant something else. Well, the reason you can't cross it up, it has a different purpose, that other field. It has a different target, and it has an entirely different basis of operation. Well, their purpose is to make people quiet. Give you how wildly different this is. You want to get upset when you see a very quiet PC, man. His idea of treatment is based on the common denominator, as far as he's concerned, that men are animals that rose spontaneously from a sea of ammonia, and he wots not of. And all thinking is done by the brain, and so forth. So this is a different, completely different zone or area. And it has not produced results, so we needn't pay any attention to it. We don't care how loudly somebody beats the drum and says, this is authority. Those people are the authorities who can get the results, and those are the authorities. A painter is somebody who can paint a picture. An authority on painting has been Hobson-Jobsoned over into somebody who can criticize a picture. Well, anybody can criticize a picture, so I guess any child then is an authority on painting. So that the thing doesn't hold up when you take it from a critical viewpoint, you see. No, an authority is the fellow who can do it. And the world in apathy and failure, driving out in various lines and directions where they have been unable to do anything, have elected authorities on subjects that can't do them. So therefore you would become all crossed up with fields that have failed. And that would enter all by itself an ingredient of failure into Scientology. So we have to leave their technology alone. We have to leave their nomenclature strictly alone. We cannot talk about ids and egos. We can't really talk about the unconscious. We can't discuss, in other words, what we're doing in terms of what they were doing, because they didn't do anything. And we would immediately come a cropper, and we would be in very bad shape indeed. So we have to have technology named in a certain way as to convey a meaning. And we are the people who can get results in the field of the mind, so therefore we are the authorities. So therefore we don't have to pay any attention to anybody else who sets himself up in authority, because any raving madman could go down here at the crossroads and say, I know all about grapes. See, I am the world's greatest authority on grapes. And any raving madman could do this, you see. He could just go on screaming, I am the world's greatest authority on grapes. Well, he could get a few other madmen who would come around and say, you're the world's greatest authority on grapes. Nobody ever would think of asking this madman perhaps the question, have you ever eaten a grape, seen a grape, raised a grape, or done anything with a grape? And of course, if the answers were all no to those questions, then of course it would be quite obvious that he was a raving madman. And that's the psychiatrist. He has never seen a mind. He never created one. He never changed one. He never brought about any results in this particular field. The only thing he can brag about is being a bit destructive on the subject. And he's screaming that he's an authority, so therefore somehow or another you should borrow his nomenclature. Now any one of you sooner or later is going to run into this down at some crossroads. Why don't you use standard terminology? Well, the answer to it is, whose standard terminology? It would have to be the terminology of a person who could produce a result before it could be said to be even terminology. So man has had not much understanding of this particular field and has even gone into an inversion where he has elected to have the nomenclature of the field standardized by people who know nothing about it. Now that's the wildest inversion that anybody could ever dream of. Not only is there no terminology, but there's a great deal of false terminology. That terminology is false. You start to lead down that line, you're going to be in trouble. Somebody's going to say to you sooner or later, why don't you use standard nomenclature, why don't you do this, and why don't you do that? Well, my rebuttal on it, of course, is always very savage. When somebody starts in on me like this, I have no idea that they're trying to be helpful. I never make that mistake. So I just cut them up and serve them for dinner. And it's something on this particular line, I would answer, well, why haven't you developed anything that could be used? So Dr. Spinbin is standing there, well, why don't you use standard terminology so that somebody can understand you? Why the hell haven't you invented any? What do you mean? Well, why don't you know something about the mind? Why do you stand around being such a fake for? Well, really? I have a degree. I know that degree doesn't mean anything. Take one of these patients out of one of these rooms that you've got down here. Bring him out here and heal him. I want to see it. Oh, well, you can't do anything like that. Therefore, you're a fake. To hell with you. This is my idea of a polite conversation with one of those guys. I hate fakes. And it's interesting that the only mud they can throw at us is that we're somehow fakes. The overt doth speak loudly in accusation. Shakespeare rewritten. Now, therefore, you can't help but have trouble with terminology, nomenclature. I've had trouble with it. Don't think I haven't. How do I dream up some word that will describe something that can be found, can be examined, and does exist, that will not conflict with some other school of nomenclature which has failed. How do I move into that perimeter? Oh, he could probably do a much better job, but part of the trouble is you. You accept certain lines and start using them in your common communication, and then the last thing in the world that I could do is pull them away from you and say, well, actually, a better word is so-and-so. What little Scientology terminology you know is now dead and non-existent. We're going to substitute a brand new terminology, and you would be upset. Right? So terminology has to deal with this factor of evolution and use. We not only have evolved it, and they've wobbled a little bit on their meanings occasionally, but then they get into use, and they get fixed on the printed page. They get into bulletins, and they get into your certificates and so forth. Certifying HCA, well, he's supposed to know what a reactive mind is. Great, so the next day we're going to call it something else. We've immediately wiped out part of his education, haven't we? And we've made it hard for him to communicate with anybody who is trained later. If we want dissonance, why, we're going to get it in a very large cacophony if we go knocking apart the terminology we have developed. So we have to safeguard the terminology we've developed. So therefore, when we learn more about the subject, you see, the word may become unreal, but we're still using it. So the only thing we can do is actually elect those things which are the most important in the mind and keep that terminology as standard as possible. First, try to evolve it as cleverly as possible so that it won't conflict. First, try to evolve it cleverly so it won't conflict and bring about a misunderstanding and some older activity. And then we've got to carry it forward as a standardized item and then not go changing it all over the place just about the time everybody learns what it is. So there's a certain necessity here to maintain a constant on nomenclature and terminology. Now, another responsibility is not develop too many of them. Not to go whole hog on the subject, not to try to name everything in sight some new peculiar name. Nobody would ever get around the end of. The vocabulary of Scientology is probably about 472 major words, which is a small enough technical vocabulary. The medical vocabulary is something on the order of 20 to 40,000, somewhere in that range, of very peculiar words that don't mean a thing. So your task in learning Scientologies is relatively short, relatively brief compared to other technical fields. Now you could complain about any technical field on the subject of its nomenclature, and its nomenclature is just very often 5 times as silly, if you look at it that way, as Scientology is inapplicable. Some of these specialized fields are really marvelous. But if you have a bent for it, if you have a knack for it and are amused by these nomenclatures and terminologies and special languages, you might say, you can have a lot of fun with some of these. I know I recently have been hobnobbing in the world of the circus. Well, fortunately, I know a little of the circus terminology, but from an American circus viewpoint, and I don't know that this holds good in the English circus, you see. Well, you daren't use, I'll show you now, the upper class of terminologies. They're all snob. These languages are all snob languages, including Scientology. The boy that comes out of his HCA class, you see, and he throws off a couple of words, and there's 2 or 3 that understand what he's talking about and so forth, and they chin together, see. It's like the lodge has just passed the password, see. Other people stand around with their jaws dropped and say they're listening to the upper elite. Well, to that degree they are, you see. Somebody has a superior understanding, but this is a signal system. And actually, I couldn't take that away from the subject if I had to. If I didn't invent it, you would. Give you, in the circus world, if you use carnival, the carnival, you see, is pretty downscale. To the circus, a carnival is almost beneath contempt. These things are quite definitely fixed on the social strata. So you daren't use carnival terminology, of which I know of about 400 or 500 words in carnivalese. You daren't use that in referring to the same identical objects and actions in the circus world. And the circus world has maybe 700, 800, 1,000 words, you see, for these same things. You've seen the same thing. You've run into it in Low Dutch and High Dutch in languages and so on. So you have to be very careful about some of these. But quite the reverse, you can tell a real organist. This is in the world of music. You can tell a great concert pianist by the awe with which he speaks the word Steinway, and with which he speaks of his instrument, and with which he speaks of his scores, and so on. You can tell him. He acts the part of a snob in his long-tailed coat and his flowing gestures and his posers with his hands over the keyboard and all that sort of thing. You know this boy for what he is, you see. He is a classical pianist, a classical concert pianist. Now, his terminology is quite staggering. If he and a symphony orchestra conductor were to start a conversation in your immediate vicinity, you would be snowballed. You'd never know that many musical terms taken into or out of Italian and German and that sort of thing could exist. And it would frankly be over the head of most of the very men in the symphony orchestra. They would say, God, listen to that, you know. But the field of the organ does a complete reverse. Now, an organ is an instrument which a piano is not. An organ is a percussion instrument, only to the degree that you turn on a percussion key, and beyond that you can get music out of it. But a piano, of course, is solely and only a percussion instrument. This is according to modern classification. They classify it as a percussion instrument. Well, it's a pretty trick percussion instrument, and you have to be very virtuosity on it. But an organ will also, you can throw a key on an organ and make it sound like a piano. You can also make it sound like a clavichord. You can make it sound like almost anything. And I've been hobnobbing recently with pro organists, real pros, you know, theater organists, circus organists, guys like this, you know. Actually, my hair's been standing on end. These boys rank in their field just as high as the concert pianist ranks in his field. In fact, a bit higher. Because you've got to be like Vishnu before you can play an organ, you know. 8 arms. And their terminology would absolutely bowl you over. There's 2 fields of terminology, and when you get to be a real pro in the field of the organ, where you're an organ designer as well as performer, you know, real upscale, you actually shift gears on terminology. And the organ terminology with which you're familiar is the organ terminology which is referred to by the musician, the normal musician. Well, when you go upscale, you go into a new field of terminology. So there's 2 fields of terminology in the field of the organ. And the real pro and the real snob in that particular field does a volte-face, complete volte-face, when he leaves the field of mere music into the field of playing an organ and designing them. Second we get into that field, we're in another pasture. Doesn't even look or smell the same thing. And that is so rarefied that when I first heard those boys talking and so forth, I wot-notted anything they were saying, you know. It was just like listening to the Hottentots jabbering about the next feast of Roebuck. I didn't have a clue. Well, I finally got hep to it and did a bit of organ work and designing and that sort of thing and hobnobbing with these birds, and I still don't have but a small edge on their terminology, and they're always startling with me. But I've gotten to a point now where I know what they're talking about, you know. Well, for instance, the organist at St. Paul's Cathedral, who probably would be the top amongst mere organists, you see, in England, refers to the pedal board. See, those are the board that you walk on, you know. Well, he calls that a pedal board. When you get into the real snobs, that is no longer a pedal board. That's firewood. Now, the top organist at St. Paul's undoubtedly refers to notes and pipes and footages. And the real snob calls them noises. They're noises. And he says this with complete straight face. So the first time I heard this, I thought they were gagging, you see. And every time I've heard one of these things, I've made the repeated mistake, which I am now beginning to recover from doing, of laughing like mad, you see. Thus displaying my great ignorance of the whole subject. I've gotten so I can chatter back and forth on it now. What the hell was it I heard the other evening? I think it was a Blackpool snarl. This organ was capable of a good, solid Blackpool snarl. I think I probably got the word snarl wrong, but it was capable of making a terrible clashing dissonance which would reverberate. And that was the way it was described. You catch up with it after a while. I'm getting there, though. I'm getting there. I'm getting up to a point where I now develop something that I don't think they've thought of yet with regard to firewood. And I can play a piece on firewood that they haven't thought could be played on firewood. So I'm practicing this very hard. And the next time I'm going to get even, I'm going to throw them. But the point is, as you enter into the inner sanctum of any profession, you quite normally leave the purely snob language and get into a slanguage. Lord knows what a medical doctor calls tonsils while he is dining with other medical doctors. See? But he probably calls them something else. His terminology shifts then from the very formal, with enormous forced formality, that almost has worship mixed up with it, you see. And shifts then, as his familiarity increases with his subject, into something that sounds more like slang. And we have not bothered then to go through the country of pomposity to reach the world of slang. We've just short-circuited the whole thing. It's true what I tell you about nomenclature. As nomenclature really gets up amongst the knowing, it is never serious. It is a very unserious subject. The things which great electronic engineers that can whip you out a rocket for the moon, wiring circuit or connection. Probably what they call it is not what is taught in college. You see. They've got this stuff, and it's a rattly-bang. It's almost jive talk moved upstairs into the profession, you know. It's pretty wild. Well, we've taken a straight road. Since none existed, we haven't really developed a secondary language. We're in our secondary language. So that is another way that the thing has been narrowed down. We could develop a highly pompous, formal nomenclature, a vocabulary perhaps of 2,000 or 3,000 words, and expect you all to learn it verbatim and be able to discuss it with great solemnity, only to have you eventually evolve a much less lengthy vocabulary, which is in the field of slang. And we've taken the step at one jump. So our language does not sound dignified. Our nomenclature is not pompous, since there was no reason to enter this other extraneous step into it. Now, anybody then who is talking to you about not using proper psychoanalytic nomenclature probably himself is the veriest tyro in the field of psychoanalysis. See, he's just, well, if he graduated well and kept his nose clean, he'd become a neophyte, you know. Or he wouldn't be expressing this reverence for nomenclature, because it's symptomatic of the stage where you are simply memorizing without knowing. After a boy gets to know something and so forth, he normally shortens his nomenclature quite markedly and rapidly. And of course, what an organist has to know who is up in the field of engineering and design and so forth, this circus organist, Kit Francis, for instance, hasn't any stop. Well, actually, the stops on his organ do not agree, I'm sure, with what it says on the stops. And he's pulled out most of the stops. He's thrown them away. When he had the organ rebuilt, he threw them away. What he did was just get the noise combinations from the generators. And he put a stop on each variable noise combination from the generators, knowing how they hooked up. And he knows that if he throws bing, bing, and why, he's got then these two noises come out of the generator, they'll combine, they'll sound in a certain way. He's setting it up by electronic sound. Electronic combinations of sound. So he's even done away with all of the izzards and piccolos and diapasons, and nothing says anything. You know, there it is. As a matter of fact, the other day I saw him throw a 64-foot pipe together out of an upper scale. There weren't any even 32-foot pipes in the thing, but he just got a couple of things that would then sound like they built down. And he threw those in, and the next thing you know, he had St. Paul's Cathedral going at a very mad rate. But that organ doesn't happen to have any such stops. So he doesn't even refer to noises by their traditional names anymore. See? In other words, when a guy gets to know his business, he generally throws away, when he really knows his business, he throws away the nomenclature he doesn't need. He gives it the oh-heave. And he quite commonly, amongst his brethren who are in the know and part of the lodge, develops a short-circuited slang-type nomenclature to describe what he is. Well, knowing some of these things and so forth, I've tried very hard to reduce the nomenclature of Scientology as far as possible and keep it only in the realm of slang, where it would have evolved to anyhow. And that would save you a lot of trouble. But if you went back over the years and found the name of everything that had been named, you would probably arrive with a much larger vocabulary than 472. But a lot of those things have been given the oh-heave. But a lot of old-time auditors still know what they were. Now, the dependence of knowledge upon nomenclature is extraordinary, and as a matter of fact, almost never appreciated by teachers or students. They are trying to talk and use a language they don't know. And this can get so bad that they think the subject is incomprehensible or that they are incapable of understanding it, when as a matter of fact this is not what is wrong at all. It's just that they haven't grasped the meaning of some of these symbols that are being used to designate. And they haven't got an instantaneous grasp of these meanings. They've got a fumble grasp of them. That is, if they thought for a while, they might possibly be able to remember what an engram is. See, now that's the grasp of it. And as they go on studying past these points of uncomprehended nomenclature, they begin to stack up an opinion that they don't know about it. And it isn't it that they don't know about. To get a persistent thing, you see, you'd have to have a lie. And the lie is that it isn't the subject they are having trouble with. It is simply the nomenclature they are having trouble with. They don't know about the nomenclature, so they, however, wind up with an opinion that they don't know the subject. Or there's something very incomprehensible about this subject. No, it isn't the subject at all. They just don't know their nomenclature. You see how important nomenclature is. But a comprehension of the nomenclature which is used is primary to the study of anything. Now, for instance, I'm studying a parallel course to get insights into study of Scientology. And a very, very smart thing, an extremely smart thing to do, is to take a page of material and look over it for words you don't know. Words that don't instantly react to you. Circle each one of those words or make a list of each one of those words. And look up and study their definitions or ask people and get definitions for them. Find out exactly what those words mean. Don't tackle the subject of the page. Just tackle the nomenclature of the page. Get that nomenclature, slick as a whistle, tackle a subject, you find out the subject was very easy. But one runs across this thing, service facsimile. What's that? Another word. What's that, you see? And what's that? And what's that? Well, if you want to put yourself in a total mystery, go ahead and study pages you don't know the words on. Then you can put yourself into a gorgeous mystery. Now, this language is so common to your instructors. It's so common to people around here. And their snob action, which we have, don't doubt about that, see? And will continue to have, because it is an index of status and competence, will cause them to explain these things to a student with a bit of a sneer. They're liable to cure you of asking, what is a service facsimile? Because you'll hear in the answer that comes back to you at least the tone for, well, you idiot, why don't you look it up in your bulletin? You know, fancy anybody not knowing that. See? This is sort of reflected in the atmosphere you get back when you ask these things, and that again makes you feel stupid for not knowing it. Well, actually, nothing can be done to minimize this latter. Well, I could say, always answer a student's questions politely. And you probably only build up a covert hostility. They'd answer the questions politely and flunk all tests for 24 hours. Something wild is liable to go awry when you start to put the brakes on some natural action. So the only point I'm making here is don't let yourself be put off because somebody thinks you're stupid because you don't know it. You're not stupid because you don't know it, you're simply uninformed. Well, if you're uninformed, don't get so status happy of thinking that you must appear bright in order to be thought well of when it has nothing to do with it. You're here to learn, and anybody is studying anything is studying it, I suppose, to learn it, not to acquire. He may acquire status through having learned it, but he doesn't acquire status by pretending he knows it. When he doesn't, as a matter of fact, he acquires himself quite a headache. So the point is, in spite of any rebuff that you get, or of difficulty digging into some book to find out what it means, you actually put yourself in a soup at once the moment that you leave one word in a sentence behind you you do not know the meaning of. One unknown piece of nomenclature left behind you can absolutely ruin your comprehension of the whole thing you're studying. Now, if you want to speed up your grasp of a situation, apparently do it the slow way. This obviously is a slow way to do it, isn't it? But it's not the slow way to do it because it snowballs. You'll get faster and faster and faster. Whereas if you don't do it this way, you will get slower and slower and slower. So never leave a word behind you in a study that you don't know the meaning of. And when you hear me use word in a lecture, and I try to minimize nomenclature actually in lectures, when you hear me use a word in a lecture that you don't know the meaning of, for God's sakes, write it down in your notes and right after the lecture find out what it is. What is that word? It's something that has passed you by. Well, it's that which you don't understand, not the mind, not Scientology, not the theories and practice of Scientology. The stumbling block, first and foremost, is simply nomenclature. Now, nomenclature will be there regardless of any reform undertaken, because in the first place we are examining things which are not hitherto known. So they have to have a name. Now, somebody uninformed may try to tell you that some of these things were known, but that's merely his misinformation talking. He doesn't know what you were talking about, so he thinks it was previously known. He will try, for instance, to compare an id and a thetan. See, and he said, well, Freud described all that. He said id, and an id was something, and well, probably a person saying this to you really doesn't know what Freud said was an id. See? His nomenclature failure is prior to his misunderstanding where you are. See? So, if you want to wind yourself up in a ball and become very confused and get a lot of slow passes and go slower and slower and slower and slower, just start leaving words behind you. You don't know what they are. You get halfway down the page, all of a sudden there's a word you've never seen before. Just say, well, I'll catch that later and go on. Why don't you just say, well, I'll cut my throat right now and add several weeks onto my course progress? Because that's just what that'll do. You cannot help but wind up at the end of that page. Now, the next thing is the subject matter itself, arrangement and understanding of. Now, this is your second one. Now, it's all right to name something and get a definition for something, but what is being named? And if you were very, very clever, you would worry it and snarl at it and walk around the circles of any piece of subject matter. Now we're talking about a thing. See, we're not talking about the name of the thing, we're talking about the thing. You'd walk around any one of those pieces of subject matter until you had a good comprehension of what that was all about. What the devil are we talking about? See? I'll give you an idea. You say, well, a person has a bad opinion of another person because they have an overt against that person. All right, there's a thing, you see. That is a mechanism that surrounds the overt motivator sequence. That's one of the phenomena. Joe is mad at Bill, And if you search a little bit, you'll find out he's mad at Bill because he's done something to Bill. Joe has done something to Bill. Now, this is contrary to the explanation everybody makes in life. So it is very easily read this way. See? Because life is that way, you can get this thing wrong way too in your skull. See? So Joe is mad at Bill because Bill has done something to Joe. Yes, I understand that. Well, you missed the whole point. Thereafter, if you've done that, you will really never then understand how to pull an overt or why you must do so. That has gone up in smoke. Very important mechanism. Joe is mad at Bill because Joe has done something to Bill. All right, that is the thing. Now, several things can get in the road of the acceptance of this thing. And first and foremost is it isn't usual or ordinarily thought of this way. And that gets in your road by misinterpretation. You think you've read something you haven't read. See? Because it's so usual for it to be the other way. You think you've read it the other way. Or it is so widely accepted the other way that it is simply unbelievable. So there's the next thing that gets in your road is the unbelievability of it. You say, well, that couldn't possibly be true. Now, for heaven's sakes, make sure when you come to the unbelievability of something that you know what you're unbelieving. Now, that's important. That's important. Let's know what we're unbelieving. Now, to know what we're unbelieving, we have to take the first step again. The nomenclature, you see. Did I get the word right? Now, the thing, the mechanism, phenomenon here, have I got that right? And you'll find in about 90% of the cases that a re-examination at this unbelieve step, you were unbelieving the wrong thing. You weren't unbelieving what was there. You were unbelieving something else. So when you run into a total gawp, you say, that couldn't be, What? What? That couldn't be. No, that couldn't be, see? And instead of going out and jumping in the lake, or something like this, or taking cyanide, the thing to do is to check over nomenclature and the description of the thing itself. Now, if you check those two over, you'll find out you probably had something in crosswise, and that this unbelievable was not unbelievable at all, but is quite easily seen. That's about 90% of the time. The other 10% of the time, you just can't see how that works that way. Go back and check your nomenclature, check what the thing was that you're not believing, and so forth. Get down to this other thing. You still can't see how it's that way. Set yourself up some examples of how it's not that way and how it is that way. Now, this is really the first place where you really have to apply it to you and life, where it becomes a complete must. You must apply it to you. You must apply it to life. Does this thing exist in life or doesn't it? Has it existed in my life, or has it existed in anybody else's life that I know of? Is there any incident here that demonstrates this phenomena? And you start looking at it, and you'll find out that the reason it wouldn't go that way is normally a button got in its road or something like that. You didn't dare believe that it was this way. Something like that. Just an examination of it, how does it apply to me? How does it apply to life? Has it ever applied to life? Did anybody ever see this thing, you see? Do I know of any incident or anything of the sort which would exemplify this thing? Why, the other 10% that I've been talking about here, that will tend to evaporate too. And you'll say, ah, yes, now we got it. Now this procedure followed actually gives you a terribly firm grip on what you know. And careful study is not necessarily either thorough or brilliant or wise or anything else. It's merely careful. And if you work right along at it on the subject of being careful with it, and what you're careful about is as you're going down the page, poggity, you all of a sudden see this word boojum, see? What the hell is that? Now I show you how you can be stupid. That's to go on. Read the next word to it, in the hopes that somehow or other the explanation will all drop out into your lap. Gloss over that word, you've done yourself in. What's this word boojum? Boy, you better find out right now. You might glance at the rest of the sentence. Does there a parenthetical description of what boojum is in it, as you sometimes occur, or there's nothing there? It's evidently a word I'm supposed to know. It's not a new word because it's not explained in this paragraph, so it's a word I know. Boy, you go any further than that, you've just hung yourself up in a nice little brass mystery, and there you'll be, going around with a lamp looking into the dark corners and wondering what you're being mystified about. Then you'll think you're mystified about the subject, you're mystified about anything that's tracing back to this fine. You read this paragraph and you didn't understand the word in it. So of course then it didn't communicate. By not understanding the word, you inhibit any communication. You've inhibited communication between what you're studying and yourself. You've also inhibited your communication between yourself and other auditors, and you also, oddly enough, have inhibited your communication yourself in a PC, because this is something in a PC that you will not thereafter recognize because you don't know what it is. Now, following down some sort of a routine like this in study, you'll find out that you can study. It's all right for somebody to come around and say, well, you can't study and you just don't apply yourself and that sort of thing. And they've done this to people in school. They've done it to me. They used to do it to me in school. They used to say, you don't know how to study. And I used to say, gee, that's very interesting. I don't know how to study. And I accepted this, that I didn't know how to study. And I don't know that I made much of a ruckus about it, but I did manage to finally find out that this was not accompanied by any method of studying. In other words, somebody was saying to you, you don't know how to hang up a skyhook, and therefore you're very stupid indeed because you don't know how to hang up a skyhook. And it's sort of like catching snipes, same kind of a gag. See? You're supposed to stand out in the woods for hours holding a sack while they drive them in on you. Actually, they're home having some coffee. You're standing in the damp woods for hours. It's just that crude a gag. They say you don't know how to study. Well, what pretentious people. They don't know how to study either. See? There's no subject called study. If there was a subject called study, they'd start teaching it to you in kindergarten. They would certainly start teaching it to you before you were into your high schools and that sort of thing. They'd say this is how to study. I've run across various systems, but they're not in the formal textbooks. I've seen them in, remember the Pete Smith specialties from way back when that used to show on the screen and so forth, gag, one-reel comedies and so forth. Well, I've seen methods of remembering things and methods of knowing things and so forth come up in that form, but I've never seen it on a textbook basis. I myself developed a method, a method of study in defense, and I remember vividly applying this in the field of history. It's just not going on to the next paragraph unless I could shut my eyes and rattle off the last paragraph. See? It didn't increase my knowledge of history. I actually get along better just by reading a history textbook. At the end of the line, when I finish off the history textbook and somebody asks me for dates, I look in the book. I find that is the best method by which to do this. The only other method of study that I ever developed for myself in school might be of some interest, and that was just to get every book on the subject I could get hold of and read all of them and not try to concentrate on any of them, you see. I think one of the most stellar grades I ever got, and bragged about all over the place and so forth, and called upon to give lectures on every hand, made me feel a little guilty. I was taking American history, and I simply got hold of every textbook I could find on the subject of American history and read them all, including Woodrow Wilson's 5-volume History of the United States. That's one of those things that you put on a bookshelf to hold it down in case of an earthquake. I read all these textbooks, but I don't think I ever told the professor that because I was allergic to its very, very bad prose, that I had never read that class's textbook. I'd never read the class's textbook. I'd read all of the other textbooks I could lay my hands on, but I couldn't stand its prose. Its prose was horrible. It was sort of socialistically, weirdly put together, and it was pedantic and the extreme. It was full of difficult words. As a matter of fact, the fellow was sort of underplaying the places where he should have used a good, big, pompous word, you know, why he'd put some offbeat word and so forth. He didn't know how to write, see? And so I didn't read the school's textbook, but I read all the other textbooks, and I got, I don't know, A+, and gave lectures on history for them, and got gold stars and silver cups and all this sort of things, being a terrific student. Well, actually, it was just to the degree that I just covered everything in sight. I find out that's fairly reliable as a method, fairly reliable, when there isn't any training available, you know, like an American school. When there's absolutely no training available, what you want to do is just get a hold of every book on the subject in sight and then just read them all from cover to cover, see? Making very sure, I would now and do, and always did, that you didn't cross over words you didn't know. Get yourself a great big dictionary and get yourself some kind of an anthology or something that went along with it, and look up a word you didn't know and find out what that was related to, and then get that word real good, and then go sailing on your way. It wouldn't matter if you read a book in 5 hours, you see. It wouldn't matter how fast you read the book or didn't read the book. That's in absence of formal, knowable training on any subject. That's a very good method. Excellent method, as a matter of fact, because you wind up at the end of the thing. You've seen this word so often, you've looked it up so often, you eventually know what it is, you know. You say, there again is the Rembrandt profile. What the hell is it, even a Rembrandt profile? Well, a Rembrandt profile is actually, well, I guess it must have been something painted by Rembrandt, but they must mean something here. I'll turn back over here. I saw a mention of it over here. Here's a description of the thing. Yeah, and so on and so on and so on. Oh, I get it. It's the main light is not showing on the front of the face. Oh, good. Yeah, it's just the fill shows on the face. Ah, that's good, yeah. I got that now. All right, sail along the line and so forth. And finally, I forgot all about that, you see, but chapters later we run into Rembrandt profiles. A what? No. Something about a fill. Yeah. Well, I know where I can find it. I'll go back. Ah, yes. Main light back the person, fill in the front of the person. Yeah, face mainly in shadow. Yeah, I got it. Nothing to it. All right, running down the line, chapters later, another textbook on the subject. When shooting a Rembrandt profile, so on, so on, so on, so on. Oh, that's how you do. You add a spotlight to it also. Okay, you see the word no longer operated as an impasse to your study. You're looking up words and meanings and so forth. There's sort of the the erosive course of the river. And it eventually grinds away on the banks until it has a good, strong, flowing stream, you see. Actually, I don't think there are bright students and dull students. I don't think this at all. I don't think so, because I've never seen any real coordination between knowledge of the subject and the brightness and dullness of the student. But there is a careful student and a careless student. Now, a student can be very fast and still be very careful. Hasn't even too much to do with speed. But he knows when he's whipped. That's about the only thing he knows. He's reading down this paragraph, and all of a sudden he wakes up to the fact he hasn't the foggiest clue what the devil what he's reading about, so he goes back and finds out where he got tangled up. Ah, well, here was a word, and here was a phenomenon he didn't know anything about. Now, if he's a careful student, he puts it all away until he finds out what that word and what that phenomena is, and exactly what that is, and he gets that straight. He may cruise along in the thing just a little bit further to find out if it's defined in that particular publication, see? But he's looking for the definition. He's not any longer doing it. Now, there's a careful student. And his brightness on the subject is dependent upon the degree he does this. Independent on any native talent or anything else. It isn't even dependent on his buttons. And in Scientology, because of the tremendous amount of breadth of study we're doing, and because we are studying what we study with, why then it's necessary to have some command of the subject of study. It becomes absolutely imperative in our field to know something about how to study, and it's no longer walking up to some poor luckless student and saying, well, the trouble with you is you don't know how to study. Then walking off, you see. Or saying about some other student, well, he's just stupid, that's all. See? That explains it all. See? Frankly, it doesn't explain a doggone thing. We hear about the lightning quick student. We hear about the very, very fast student. And we hear about the very, 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 very slow student. And we hear about the grind. And we hear about the brilliant student. And honest, those classifications have no more validity than the field of psychiatry. Why? Because they have never produced uniform, fast study. They're apparently merely excuses and justifications of something. They're an effort to classify on something nobody's cracked. So why should we talk about dull students and slow students and brilliant students and so forth? There are certain phenomena in study which are worth commenting upon. And one of those is the oddball who can memorize almost at a glance, and who can go back and spit out the memorized words. I've known Chinese students that got anybody whipped I ever in the Anglo-Saxon world or in the Western world, anything whipped on this line. I know Chinese students who go ahead and give you pages of mathematical formulas and things of this character and descriptions of it and so forth. About the wildest thing you ever listened to. They come to school the next morning with their lessons and, wow. You ask them, all right, now let's go into the slope formula. Well, the slope formula is so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. It's all there, see? You say, wow. Don't say instantly, well, then this is the very man we need to build the dam. Because building dams has very little to do with study of that particular kind or character. We don't even know if he could solve the problems on the page. But he sure could remember them. And that's a test mainly of memory. Now, if you want to be sure of this person, in examining this person, you'll find immediately what's going wrong here. Immediately you'll find what's going wrong. There's a way of examining this person that would only be fair to the instructor and to the student alike. take any oddball word that occurred in the first paragraph you have just got back so glibbishly and ask for a definition of that word. The definition is not given on the subject matter which the person is going. And if you want to see a hunted, horrified look come into anybody's face, it's the perfect memory repeat. See? And you've thrown an axe into it because you've asked for something which isn't memory. You've asked for the definition of a certain word. And if this person, now look at this, if this person could give you this whole paragraph and tell you all about it, but couldn't define a word in it, that person must be in total mystery about that. So the missing ingredient is understanding. And then naturally the missing ingredient, application, will show up soon afterwards. Do you see how that would work? In other words, this very, very fast study falls down exactly as the slow study would fall down. In other words, everybody caves in on this same point uniformly. Now somebody comes up and he takes this same thing and he stumbles all over the place and he tries to get it out and he spits it out and so forth. The examiner could ask him too, the same word. What's the definition of that word? And he'd say, well, I don't know. Puts him in the same boat as fast study, doesn't it? So the direction and end purpose of study is understanding. And of course, with an unknown word in the middle of it, an unknown phenomenon in the middle of it, you're not going to get understanding at all. You're going to get disbelief, non-comprehension. You're going to get mystery. You're going to get, of course, also non-application. Now, if we examine study a little bit further, the main complaint about study is that it does not immediately and at once result in good, clean, clear application. This is one of the primary scolds about modern education. Primary criticisms is that you educate an engineer, or you educate an engineer and you don't dare send him out to build a bridge. See? Well, that's in the field of application or practice of application. But if this man can't go out and build a bridge after he's been taught to build a bridge, the familiarity ingredient, of course, is missing. But even so, if somebody had borne down on him like mad for the definition of every word that he was stumbling across in the direction of bridge building, he should be able to go out and unroll his sextant and transit and get to work. He should. He should. He's now got the horrible task of acquiring his familiarity, but he wouldn't be doing it across the barrier of a misunderstanding of his terminology, a misunderstanding of his tools, and he theoretically could do it. I found myself doing it the other day. I just had a textbook command of a certain problem on this line, a parallel line I'm studying. I just had a textbook command of the thing. Nothing but, and I saw it happened, and applied the textbook, and it resolved, bang. And I had about something on the order of maybe 2 or 3 seconds to do the whole thing, because something was happening and I had to straighten it up back. Just textbook. It worked. It worked perfectly. So therefore, you could and should be able to take a purely textbook thing, if it was a valid textbook and a valid subject, and apply it directly without familiarity. Now think of what a whiz you would be, however, if you also had the familiarity at the same time, and that's why we study auditing while auditing. See? But if this other ingredient of careful study is missing, the nomenclature is missing, you can't make the boat. It just won't make the boat. I studied been studying this parallel subject very hard because it is a bear cat on the subject of terminology too. It's terminology that you'd think anybody that'd been around photography very long would be very familiar with. He couldn't help but be familiar with it. Oh, no, 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 not when you're studying text after text after text after text after text. Well, if you're taking some little course that didn't have much to do with the price of fish, that didn't intend to make a pro out of you along any line. And this is how you develop pictures. The Eastman book for the home beginner, you know, I've read those by the ton. No, I haven't got anything to do with it. It says hammer, pound, hit him with the grape, you know, no holes barred. Now we charge with the bayonets. You take the metabisulfide and pour it into the yada pin, and you say you take the what? And you're busy in the very next lesson studying a completely disrelated field of the same subject. Make sure that you adjust the head screen. The what? Where the hell did this come from? I've never met it before around here anyplace. A head screen. A head screen. Now what is a head screen? Scatter, scatter, flutter, flutter, look in the dictionary and so forth. What do you know? It isn't in the dictionary. It's so common they don't have to define it. But I don't know it. No worry now about how stupid this makes me, you see. Flutter, flutter, bing, bang. Finally figure it out by context and by illustration. There was a picture of all of the photographic material needed. A head screen. Obviously, a head screen is what you hold back the corner of the main light for so as to get a prominent ear to be less prominent. Obvious, isn't it? A head screen. Who would have dreamed it, man? A nonsensical but very usual piece of equipment. The guy writing the textbook, being so familiar with his subject, would make the same statement that you would make, you see. You say, well, you set your E-meter down on the table first, of course. You have said it almost sarcastically. You see. Well, you set your E-meter down on the table, of course, before you start auditing. If he wanted to be really sarcastic, he'd make such a remark. This guy, this bloke, this expert on portraits, to end all experts on portraits, says, well, of course you adjust the head screen to hold back that. That's the way you subdue the light. He just says this parenthetically, you see. This is how you make less prominent undesirable features on a subject in portraiture. You hold back the light on them. What do you hold back the light with? Get the same answer out of the textbook, oh, don't be an ass. Yeah, but what do you hold back the light with, you know? You hold it back with a head screen, of course, you idiot. What's a head screen? What is a head screen? What is this thing? Put it over the PC. Put it over the lens of the camera so it doesn't show the fellow's head. So it's been very amusing because I can look at a subject, you see, from an oblique. Look at the same study problems that you run into, and I've been analyzing these problems and putting them together. What I've been talking to you about, and what I've talked to you about in recent things, has been the views I have had on this has worked out, and as I know they apply in our own field, and I think you've been making some progress as a result. But there are just these points about study. You expected there would be probably a lot more complex points about study, but there are no more complex points about study than I have just given you. Now, of course, if you didn't read or write English, there would be a further study on nomenclature. But remember, it would just be a further study on nomenclature. So it even falls into that particular field. Now, the person who can't talk at all, or let us say an animal, trying to arrive at this particular line, he's totally out of communication. He hasn't got the vocal cords. He can't be educated in the first place. You say, well, that's a totally lost field. Well, I'm not completely willing to lose that field utterly, because I've already raised animals in tone to a remarkable degree, and I've already met dogs that could talk, see? Yeah, I met a dog one time that used to say hungry every time he wanted chow. He managed it somehow. He used some Hollywood scheme of how you breathe from the diaphragm, you know. But he could say it clear as could be. He was hungry. Startled people most to death because they'd say, well, that's funny. The dog probably makes a grunch, you know. And this mistress has taught him and so forth. It's just being too for words. And then they'd hear this dog, and this dog would say, hungry. They go, oh. And I was talking to an elephant the other day that wanted his picture taken. And I run into animals that know their cues much better than their trainers. Have to pull the trainer through the act somehow and make him look good. But anyway, that be as it may, the point is that the communication of the nomenclature, of the language, of the ability to talk or communicate would be the first barrier, don't you see? And so it remains into the fellow who does know English, who can read, who sits there and so forth. It's still his first barrier, but of course he is so high on this level of communication, he is contemptuous of these little inabilities to communicate, and so neglects them. And neglecting them, then of course he comes an awful cropper when he gets into the field of study, and that is about the first place where he really falls down. There are many ways you could make a person fail in studying, but mostly it would be in denying them an insight into the necessity of understanding the communication symbols used. That would be a big failure in delivering the field of study. So it takes you a half an hour to learn what this word is. Boy, that's a half an hour that won't get multiplied and added on to the end of your course when you're busy floundering around wondering why you just can't seem to get to first base on that particular quarter. Well, I hope what I told you today be of some use to you. Thank you very much.